In Chapter 7, they introduce a lot of the empirical research around political representation of women based on political causes. And in previous chapters, we were looking at the supply side of women based on cultural traditions and social structure. And in this chapter, we look at the demand side. So things like political parties, which may have different levels of demand for women candidates, and voters who may or may not support these women candidates, are elements of political factors that affect the demand side for women as candidates and as legislators. Going back to the political recruitment process that was discussed in Chapter 5, once women decide that they would like to run for office, they must pass two barriers at the end of the process. They must be selected as candidates by gatekeepers and elected to office. And the political recruitment process highlights that gatekeepers decide who among political aspirants gets to run as a candidate. Most of the time, these gatekeepers are political parties. In most countries, the recruitment and selection of political elites occur entirely within political parties. Political parties operate in systems that may be more or less democratic. Democratic systems that have clear, well-detailed, and consistent rules make it easier for parties and candidates to follow the rules of the game. Non-democratic systems, in contrast, might be based on the charisma of an individual leader or held via military force, leading to intermittent elections, changing rules, and difficulties in determining how political power can actually be attained. Also, the meaning of candidate or legislator differs depending on whether a country is a democracy or not. In some countries, women run as candidates in corrupted elections, and in others, they are placed into legislatures that act purely as rubber stamps for the policies of a president for life. One of the most basic ways to classify governments is by labeling them democracy, semi-democracies, or authoritarian regimes. And whether countries are democratic or not can influence whether women can attain and how they can attain political power. It also influences how effective they can be once they are in office. The relationship between democracy and women's democratic representation depends on which type of office you look at. For example, women have higher levels of representation in cabinets when they are in democracies, and that's not necessarily the case in parliaments or legislatures. Another important thing to note is that democracy is never static, and in cases of democratic transition, sometimes the initial move can result in temporary declines in women's representation. But again, those are usually temporary, and women's representation picks up. In general, looking at longer time periods, research shows that democratic growth equals gains for women by expanding civil liberties, which helps growth in developing civic skills and experience in the political activist realm. In addition, in some cases, the transition to democracy happens after periods of civil war, having a long experience with a military dictatorship or other form of authoritarian leader, which can make women as political outsiders more attractive candidates for the executive office. So women heads of states are more likely to occur amidst democratic transitions, but their record is unimpressive. Less than half of those who transitioned since 1975 have elected a woman president or prime minister of their country. Women also might be effective in authoritarian national legislatures in spite of a lack of democracy, depending on cultural context and depending on the manner in which they are appointed. Another factor impacting whether women can be effective in authoritarian legislatures depends on the degree of agenda-setting ability and ability to check the executive that exists within that particular authoritarian legislature. So proportional representation systems, or those that allow for seats to be allotted based on the percentage of the vote won, are more representative of women than those that elect people to legislatures on a single member district or winner-take-all system. Those are also called plurality majority systems. The reason it's called plurality majority, that's the most accurate term, is because a person or a candidate can win in a single member district without the majority of the votes if more than two people are running for that seat, because only one person can win. So the major reason that proportional representation benefits women is district magnitude. This is essentially the number of seats that are electable in any district. So the higher number of magnitude, the higher number of legislators elected to each district, the more this advantages women, because it allows women to be placed on lists without being seen as displacing men. So this sort of involves a little bit of overlap with the cultural explanation that people still expect men to be in these positions. So the system publishes lists of candidates for each party that lets them know who's going to be placed in seats, and they can get a little bit of an idea of which candidates will actually be placed in seats based on the placement of these candidates on the party list. But there are important differences in PR systems. Not all PR systems have large district magnitude. So some of them may have 20 representatives for one district, and some may only have 3. Obviously, the larger the level of district magnitude, the better it is for women. In addition, where women are positioned on this list matters, because if they are situated at the very bottom of the list, their likelihood of actually obtaining seats, if the party wins even a big percentage, it becomes lower. On the other hand, if parties place women at every third or every other position, then you are guaranteed a woman to be placed in a seat if that party wins enough seats to actually, or wins enough votes to actually translate them into seats. And another element that's important is whether or not the PR system has a closed list or an open party list. Sometimes the closed list is kept really within the party elites, and other times it is an open party. And whether that is beneficial sometimes depends on the culture that you're in, but largely they have found that closed party lists are beneficial to women, because then the cultural tension of displacing men doesn't become a controversy for the voters. And not all minority groups are the same, and nor are countries in which they live the same. So substantially sized, geographically concentrated minority groups can benefit from plurality majority systems if district boundaries are not drawn in ways that carve up the neighborhoods where minorities live. And minority women are increasingly gaining representation under these circumstances. For example, in the UK, the United Kingdom, which uses a plurality majority system, elected South Asian women were elected to parliament for the first time in 2010. And there is a similar record in the United States. 37% of the women elected in 2018 were women of color, and overwhelmingly elected in districts in which minority groups hold a numerical majority, which is also called a majority-minority district. When it comes to appointments, we do see that women are appointed to cabinets more often in parliamentary systems. There are unclear reasons behind that. In addition, when we look at women's access to high courts, we do see differences in judicial appointments, and that these seem to relate to low levels of equality. Related to this, women are more likely to be appointed in countries where the selection process is exposed to electoral accountability. So where judges are elected or have some sort of connection to the election of the person who appoints them, versus just clear lifetime appointments. These are very different types of accountability, and women are more likely when there is electoral accountability. There's also evidence that women fare better in elections than those who are chosen by appointment. Women are also more likely to be appointed where representation is already existing and widespread. Another important concept is the glass ceiling. Once women have entered into certain positions within the cabinet or as head of the government, countries are more likely to repeat that behavior. And then finally, appointments are useful for women in office in the future because women are shown empirically to advance more women into positions where they're able to than men do. So when we look at political parties, it's important to understand how they pick candidates because they are the critical gatekeepers for political careers. Women's representation, therefore, is linked to parties who have a history of asking women to run for office less often. And party elites in many countries are in charge of selecting candidates, and they can be some of the most resistant to gender equality. Largely because parties want candidates that have a record of winning. So incumbents, people who have already held office, who have a record of winning, are more likely to get party endorsement. Empirically, left parties are historically more likely to put women candidates up for office, but in some studies, party ideology does not actually predict running women's candidates. And in fact, you see many right-leaning parties that have adjusted their strategies in order to appeal to women voters. And then there's also the question that some parties do not fit on a left-right spectrum. In some countries, political parties are built around single issues or around the interests that affect a particular religion or particular minority group. And as already mentioned, the candidate selectors, the party elite, their attitudes toward women in politics and towards having winning candidates also have an impact. So moving women into the party elite might also have an impact on opening doors for future women to do the same. So quotas establish that a minimum number of legislative seats will be occupied by women, or that a minimum number of party positions will be held by women. And whether or not this works to increase women's representation depends on a couple of important questions. The first is what level or threshold are they targeting? Are they aiming for 30% of the seats being women? Or are they aiming for 50%? The next important question is whether or not the candidate or the quota is a candidate quota, a political party quota, or simply reserved seats. The most common form, candidate quotas, are also called legal quotas or legislative quotas, requires all political parties in a country to field a certain percentage of women candidates. A political party quota is voluntary and occurs when a party chooses to adopt a set of rules or targets that a certain percentage of its candidates will be women. Some resort to a third way of regulating quotas that avoids making requirements about candidates. Instead, reserved seats mandate that a certain percentage of women are elected. Under these systems, certain parliamentary seats may be filled only by women, regardless of the number of women candidates or nominees. Some countries and parties have adopted what are known as parity quotas that have a threshold of 50% of the seats going to women. But most of these laws have not lived up to this expectation. And in addition, the quotas of 30% have also often missed their mark. This figure shows the percentage of women legislators as well as the percent of women candidates to kind of give you an example of how many people actually make it past that second gate into actually getting elected. Figure 7-2 shows the number of countries that have adopted a national gender quota, starting with the year 1950 and ending with the year 2015. So you've seen actually a huge jump starting in the 1990s, but especially since 2005 or so. Well, I would actually say around 2000. And this is just a bar chart that gives you a clearer breakdown of the timeline of quota adoption. This is a map of quotas for women around the world. The darker color represents reserved seats and mixed quotas, and the lighter color represents candidate or legislative quotas. And importantly, this is countries who have effective gender quotas, which means that these countries have actually met their targets that the quotas set down, usually 30%. And this map represents the states who have non-effective gender quotas, meaning that they do not hit their targets for women's representation. So your book has some important context that they have put in here about transgender women, and how the gender quota affects them. So I encourage you to read more into these details, but we'll end with this slide that helps us look beyond national legislatures. This map represents where subnational quotas exist, meaning local or state level quotas for women's representation. And you see that it's a pretty full map.